They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. Coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh my goodness, I see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Power Media. I am, again, Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. As we get started here, definitely please do put this in your socials and invite others to join you. If you're going to be here live, if you're going to see or hear this or watch this later, do the same thing and invite others to join the conversation and the discussion we're about to have, which is going to be a great one. We're going to go for roughly 45 minutes and see what it do what it do. But something that needs to be talked about, a variety of topics is definitely that needs more attention and should get the kind of attention that it and they are all getting. That is Queen Mother Audley Moore and the variety of issues and theories and movements that overlap with this woman's life and experience and those that she continues to give inspiration to. Fascinating work being developed here. More of it is necessary. So to that end, as we again invite people to join us, jump in, like, share, subscribe, join the channel if you can, do all of those things as well. Definitely go to blackpowermedia.org and support the channel there as well, and let us hear from you through that portal if you like as well. But let's go. And very excited, very happy to be joined by our next guest here. And I'm talking about Dr. Ashley Farmer, who, among many other things, is a historian of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics. She is currently an associate professor in the departments of History and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. The link to her full bio is already in the show description, and she is here to talk with us about existing and forthcoming work about Queen Mother Moore. Dr. Farmer, welcome to the platform. It's good to meet you and to have you join us. Good afternoon. Oh, no. Uh-oh.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Frozen? Okay, there we go.
There we go. Okay, that's a little bit of a connectivity problem. How y'all doing today?
I am as good as could be expected. I hope those in the audience are doing at least that well, and we are very happy to have you join us and to have this conversation with you. You sent me a couple of articles that you've written on Queen Mother Moore in advance of your forthcoming work. So before I raise any questions, comments, or issues, let me just invite you to maybe talk to us about Queen Mother Moore as you've been doing the research, and maybe a little foreshadowing in terms of the work you have coming out. And then we'll go from there.
So I am completing a book called Queen Mother Moore, Mother of Black Nationalism. And the title is fitting. For those of you who may be new to learning about Queen Mother Moore, she was born in 1898. She died in 1997 and was part of pretty much every major moment in Black nationalist history in the 20th century in the United States. So I love talking about her because she shows what happens when we become politicized, and we don't know how and when we'll become politicized. But at any moment, you can kind of be transformed and dedicate your life to a cause. So she was born in New Iberia, Louisiana, right outside of New Orleans, and spent her girlhood there. And by all accounts, including her own, she was raised to be, quote, a bourgeois little stinker. And by that, I mean, that's what she called herself. And by that, I mean is that she had relative privilege, even though her family was enslaved, or her father's side of the family was enslaved. Her father started a business during Reconstruction, and they did very well for themselves. However, her mother died, and then her father died, and she quickly slid down the class ladder, and ended up being a domestic in New Orleans in the 1920s. And it was there that she met and married a Jamaican man named Josiah Spraggs, who happened to be a Garveyite, right, from Marcus Garvey's hometown. And so it was also there that she first heard Garvey speak. And so one of the best stories she ever tells is that one night in New Orleans, Garvey was coming to speak. If you're not familiar with Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, the biggest Black movement the world has ever seen, and a Black nationalist organization. And so he was supposed to come to New Orleans, and the police barred him from speaking that night. And so then the UNIA, the local UNIA there, gathered their forces and gathered everybody. And the story, as she tells it, is the next time they went to the Longshoremen's Hall, a great meeting place for Black working class folks, and she had a 45 in her bra and a 45 in her pocketbook and a suitcase of bullets. And when he came out, all this, and the police came out, and she says that everybody jumped up on the couch. On the couch, on the benches, and said, "Speak, Garvey, speak. Speak, Garvey, speak." And the way she tells it is the police got scared and put their guns away, and he spoke, and she became a Garveyite then and there. Now, did Garvey come and speak in New Orleans? Absolutely. Did it happen the way she said it is? We don't know. Maybe. But the point here is that she saw this moment where Garvey was speaking as the moment and when the world made sense to her, right? Where she understood that everything she had been told about Black people in the past was wrong, and that there are real unfulfilled promises of the American nation state that only Black nationalism could solve. So she became a dedicated Garveyite and Black nationalist then and there. She spent the 30s and 40s organizing both with the Communist Party, which at the time was dedicated to more Black nationalist principles, and with any other group that would enact self-determination for Black people. By the 1950s, so again, we're talking 20, 30 years into an activist career, she begins to start organizing for reparations. She's considered the mother of the modern reparations movement, meaning that she jump-started these efforts at the grassroots level in the mid-20th century when nobody was talking about it, right? She was heckled off stages when talking about reparations in the 1950s and early 1960s. And then by then, the Black Power movement is kicking up in the late 1960s, and she's seen as a mentor to everybody from members of the Black Panther Party to the Revolutionary Action Movement to Malcolm X, who comes and sits at her feet at her Philadelphia residence in the 1960s, because she understands the philosophy of organizing and has been enacting Black nationalism for so long. By the 1970s, she has a global reputation, and she's abroad visiting Tanzania, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, and being treated as a head of state for the Black community and someone whose counsel newly liberated African leaders are seeking to talk about how we organize in a Pan-African context. And her last public appearance is at the Million Man March alongside Farrakhan. So she really is an exemplar of what it is to stay the course and try to look for a vision of freedom that you probably won't see in your lifetime, to the exclusion of your personal wealth and sometimes your personal health and benefit, but also a great guide through what it looks like to organize for Black nationalism in the 20th century at the grassroots level.
Thank you for that. So there's a lot of fascinating points that you raised just in that introduction, but also in those two articles that you sent me. And one of the questions that I've framed here is, what I wrote here is, aside from her womanhood, is it her overlapping radicalisms, or to what extent is it her overlapping radicalisms that you think presents problems for her memory, her inclusion in research, et cetera? In other words, instead of being claimed by everyone that she's touched, it seems that she gets diminished. And I was wondering, to what extent is that because that sometimes people, again, in addition to the patriarchy involved, that it's sort of, they become the jack of all trades becomes a master of none, so to speak, and she doesn't get her just due because she seems to have been everywhere and with everyone. So but you talk about, and I do want to ask you specifically about the archiving point that you make, but you do talk about some of the difficulties in finding her appropriately researched and discussed.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. Certainly, first and foremost, Black nationalism is most often associated with strong Black men like a Garvey or a Malcolm. And even though we know Black women have and continue to be practitioners and theorizers of Black nationalism, we certainly don't give them their due in the same way. Some of it has to do with the fact she had a third grade education when her mother died and her father died. She was actually being educated in segregated Catholic schools in New Orleans, but that stopped. And so she wrote poetry, really bad poetry, and a speech here or there. It's incredible. In the book, I'm just like, girl. But but she did not, her written form was not the primary way in which she expressed her political ideologies, right? So therefore we don't have the same kind of archive, and we don't always treat that with the same respect that we do kind of textual things or speeches and things that have been published and circulated. I think another issue is her longevity, right? She, by the time most people know her now, she was in her 60s or 70s. And so she was seen as an elder and a mentor and certainly allowed to stay in the room. But there's a way in which we think about organizing and nationalism and protesting as a young person's game, particularly a young men's game. So I think that, any folks that know her from this later period revere her in that way, but don't see her as central, even though she was. And I think some of that has to do with her age as well. So there's many different reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with class. A lot of it has to do with educational background and the way she transmitted her ideas. And of course, a significant amount to do with being a Black woman.
So, and obviously say any more on that you'd like, but I did specifically want to ask, you wrote, and my notes are not organized properly, so I'm not sure which article it was in. And I think at least one of them is linked in the show description, if not both, but for folks to follow up on. But the question of archival research and what you made, I think a few interesting points specific to that, and it becoming another hurdle or barrier to. So could you say a little bit about what you said?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about Queen Mother Moore and most Black women that I research, including a lot of ones from my first book, Remaking Black Power, is that the most complete kind of day-to-day accounting that we have of their lives is through their FBI file, right? The government, even though we hear about, COINTELPRO and its efforts to end folks like Huey Newton or Fred Hampton, what many people don't realize is that Black women were pursued consistently for decades by Hoover and the FBI. So it is quite a mind gymnastics thing to have to begin to start by thinking about these women and trying to track out their lives through the lens of government surveillance and government repression. Queen Mother Moore's FBI file is thousands of pages long. They started surveying her in the 1920s, even before the rise of COINTELPRO, and continued well throughout the 1960s and 70s. So there's one issue of we're not collecting their papers, their writings, their protest in a traditional archive, in part, I think, because they're women, in part, I think, because they're Black, in part because they're politics, right? It is seen as fringe and is not important. And so we have to start in places like the FBI files. That's one major issue that we have with documenting radical women like Queen Mother Moore. But like I said, because there's no central archive for which I can go and put together a nearly 100-year life, you can imagine the painstaking work it takes. Now, what's interesting about this is that I was often told it couldn't be done, right? There was no archive. And that is actually not the case. What we mean when we say there's no archive about Black radical women like Queen Mother Moore is we mean it isn't completely organized, put in boxes, preserved, and put in a library somewhere. It's everywhere. And so it takes more work to uncover, but it's really quite beautiful to discover these women in the context of the communities that they're created. So to give you an example, when you're talking about her reparations activism, there's not one place you go and it's all collected, but you find it when looking at organizers in Philadelphia, and then again in California, and then again in New York, right? So one of the things we have to think about when we're preserving the lives of these kinds of women is, does it make sense for us to neatly order their stuff and put it in an archive? It certainly makes it more accessible, but it already kind of creates a preordained story about them and their lives. Or is it better that we leave their work where it is kind of entrenched in the communities that they work in, and people discover it that way, and we get to see how they're organizing in context and community? I personally think that Queen Mother Moore would be more interested in having her life preserved in all these different spaces, because that's where she worked and lived and labored, than collected in some library that lacks access to people in a lot of ways.
Right on. And it was disorderly distribution in the title of of one of the articles, and that's how you were talking about.
And I say that, you know, it's not that they're not there, it's just not distributed in a way that we like. But I also want to point out that, you know, I'm talking about a woman with Queen Mother Moore, and many women who are hunted day in and day out. I'm talking, you know, the FBI was following them every day. If you look in Queen Mother Moore's FBI file, there's instances where she marches into the FBI office and tells them that she knows they're following her every day and to stop calling her house and stop bothering her, right? But tremendous amount of resources dedicated to tracking her. So also imagine what kinds of privacy, right, and what kinds of secrecy we might allow for these women that they were not getting, to be able to not have everything kind of collected all together and borne out, right? So I think as we think about how to preserve and honor their lives, we also think about the ways in which we preserve it with an ethic of care, and possibly honor ways in which they wanted their lives discovered versus just what we want, right, as researchers.
Right on, exactly. So another one of the jokes that I missed earlier, when you talked about that she descended down the scale of class, one of the notes I did make, because I am captured by my own hip hop upbringing, was Biggie's line. She went reverse. She went from classy to ashy, as opposed to his. You know, that was wild. Anyway. But that put her in touch. I mean, in reading your work, even if it's not an introduction, it's a reminder or adds depth to the fact that, I mean, you mentioned already, she works with or comes across or is involved with Garvey and the UNIA, with the Communist Party in particular, because of their support for Black nationalism, and in the Black Belt, and you know, Chokwe Lumumba later on, Muhammad Ahmad and Revolutionary Action Movement, Malcolm X, Dr. King, Tom Mboya. I mean, all these names. I mean, and it. So okay, so that's one thing, but I do want to come back when you mention reparations, because that is. You talk about her approach to reparations, which I'd like for you to elaborate on. But then I made 3 notes as a subset of her approach to reparations, given the way it's talked about today, that I think is very interesting. So the notes I made were African identity, internal colonialism, and armed self-defense. Could you talk about her approach to reparations and maybe how you see it in support of, or maybe not in support of, the varieties or versions that are discussed popularly today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So she actually started coming to the idea of reparations, like I said, in the mid 20th century, so late 1950s. And she framed it as, she was organizing, she was back in New Orleans, she was organizing with former members of the UNIA for Black women who had been raped by white men, for Black men that were on trial for their lives. And she just said, somebody has to pay, right? Somebody has to pay for all of the atrocities that people had experienced in slavery. But also her understanding of reparations isn't necessarily linked only to slavery, because she's, you know, in the 20th century, but also to kind of the slavery's afterlives in a way. And so she sees reparations not just as a paycheck from the American government, but she sees it, one, as a way, or kind of really the only way, for African Americans to really go back to their roots and connect themselves back with Africa and African liberation and an understanding of Pan-Africanism, right? So she sees it as a conduit for Black people to come together, organized around their heritage and identity, and lobby for these things, right? She sees it as a way for the American government to make amends, but she does not necessarily mean that just because the American government pays you, you want to or live in the American nation state, right? She thinks that there's some real questions about whether or not African Americans agree that they wanted to be American at the end of the Civil War. She often writes about this, and that we were not given the choice. And so those people who do not really want to be American because they are in fact African should be able to take this money and either create an internal colony where they support and live, akin to the ideas of the Republic of New Africa, for example, as a separate group based on this. So she sees it as kind of seed money for an internal colony in that way, and an active refusal to be a part of the American nation state. And then thirdly, though, she does see it as a way for Black people to do what they wish with it, right? A way to be self-determining. She says, if you want to go and engage in America, as it were, fine. If you want to withdraw from it and become a Black nation within a nation, that's also okay. But the point here is that Black people should have the option to do with it as they wish, right? It shouldn't be earmarked in certain ways. And that it can be a conduit to both a connection to a Black past and an African past, and really a self-governing future for Black people. So it's really quite a capacious and revolutionary understanding of repayment, right? It frees you from, kind of the constrictures of American nation state and Black American identity in a lot of ways, which is very different, right, than how we're talking about reparations today, in terms of, we see it mostly like at the city level, right, or the state level, through government programs, through housing policies, through repayment for past property and land. And I don't think that Queen Mother Moore would necessarily think those were bad ways to which to do with repayment, but she would think they were very limited ways of engaging reparations. Hers is much more holistic.
And it's also used today as an anti-Pan-African political or ideological support of sorts, and she was decidedly not that. It was. So that's why I thought it was important to be reminded of that in reading your work. Similarly to that end, one of the organizations that she ended up forming, or that you write a good amount about, is in fact called the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, UAEW. And so one, just in the name, with the idea, who we talk about, we talk about Ethiopian, but could you talk about that organization? Because the work that they got involved in, I definitely want to have you come back to some of what you've already mentioned in terms of rape and sexual violence and a number of different things. But could you talk about the UAEW?
Yes. So the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women is a group that Queen Mother Moore formed along with her sisters, who were also, Garveyites and Black nationalists, when she returned to New Orleans in the late 1950s. It was a group of middle-aged Black women. So again, we're having this question of shifting the focus of organizing not only on young people, but to sustain organizing, because by this time she's in her 50s, right? And many of these women were former Garveyites that now came back and kind of rejoined the association. And you can see kind of the parallels there, right? Garvey's is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, right? She's the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. The Ethiopian part comes from her time as a Garveyite and a Black nationalist, and her heralding of Ethiopia as the one perpetually free Black nation, right? The one that was not colonized or taken over by Europeans, and kind of a promised land and an exemplar of Black nationalism. So when she's coming back after being gone for about 20 years in New York, this name signals to those in New Orleans that she is somebody who is adopting the kind of iconography and language of Garveyism as kind of an expression of her politics. So that's what they're about. But on their day-to-day level, it was really quite remarkable, the things that they did, right? they had kind of a three-pronged focus. The first was freeing Black men in Angola prison who were on death row for falsely accused for raping white women. And, this was prevalent throughout the United States, but there was certainly an epidemic of this in Louisiana. And one of the things that they do was they consciousness raised, they gathered, support and money, but they would actually go back and redo the police investigation, sometimes finding witnesses that could corroborate that these men were in fact innocent. And on more than one occasion, help stay the execution of these Black men that were really about to go to the electric chair within a matter of days or weeks. So, a real tangible difference, right? The second thing that they did is that in 1960, Louisiana passed the law that a suitable homes law, which meant that you had to have a suitable home to receive welfare. And this kicked in and kicked off hundreds of thousands of Black women off the welfare rolls. It was very much a racist policy. And not only did they collect food for these women and children, but they also drove to Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of repealing this, right? And then the third thing they did was to advocate for Black women who had been raped by white men. They argued that while Black men were sitting in jail on trumped up charges, nobody's being charged for the rampant rape of Black women, right? And even in the 1950s, this was still dangerous work. I have a picture that I feature in the book of Audley Moore pointing to bullets that through the front windshield of her car from driving from place to place, trying to raise money and raise support, particularly for these Black women. So I want to indicate to people that this was, very serious and very dangerous and potentially life-threatening work to be doing in Louisiana in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But what was really interesting is that she's constantly linking this to ideas of Black nationalism. She's saying, look, you can't get your fair due here. So what you should do is be advocating for a separate state and a separate nation, and it should be funded by reparations. So it's in that group and with these women that she really starts to advocate for reparations. But she always says our solution is for all of this is separation in a different Black nation.
Right on. Okay. Forgive me if you hear if any of this is getting picked up on the mic, but the working world doesn't stop for this show. Amazingly, yes. Surprise.
How could they not?
How could what is going on here? It's crazy, right? You also talk about. So let's see. I also had a question here about. Specific. I think you addressed that. The Sojourners was another organization and a group. Could you talk about that formation and how that and I don't think I have my timeline right, but that came before the UAEW. Yeah. Okay. Right.
A really phenomenal organization. So just to kind of help situate folks, it's in the 1920s and 30s, the Communist Party adopted what we call the Black Belt thesis that basically argued for Black people's right to self-determination and to create a separate nation in the Southern United States. Now, did everybody think that they were going to do this? Probably not, right? But what it did was signal to people that were Garveyites, in particular like Moore, that it was an organization they could get behind. So for many years, folks like Queen Mother Moore, who were Garveyites, especially after Garvey was deported in the late 1920s, worked under the banner of the Communist Party, but really kind of with Black nationalist goals in mind. One of the things that Queen Mother Moore really teaches us, in fact, is that like an organization doesn't have to have like Black nationalists in the title, right? Or it doesn't have to be the UNIA for people in it to advocate for Black nationalist ideas, right? People do that in a lot of different places. So anyway, though, communism, as many of us know, became a difficult position to maintain by the late 1940s and early 1950s and the start of the Red Scare. So women who were a part of that organization, including women like Louise Thompson Patterson, some women like Alice Childress, and then women who would be maybe considered liberals or moderates like Lorraine Hansberry, a little bit more radical, right? And club women all came together to create a separate organization as the Communist Party was falling apart in the early 1950s, called the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. And this organization really was a who's of Black women's organizing. Like I said, you had young people like at the time, like Lorraine Hansberry, playwright. You had really established women like Mary Church Joel, a club woman engaged in uplift. And you had folks like Queen Mother Moore. And their expressed goal was organizing around the plight of Black working class women. So what did this mean? It looked like one day at the Apollo Theater, they had a man with a puppet, and he was making fun of Black women. Queen Mother Moore gathers everybody, goes from house to house where they're all living in Harlem, and comes down, and they all buy tickets and shame the man off the stage, right? So that kind of everyday work, right? But it also involves larger campaigns, like freeing Rosalie Ingram, a woman who was accused of killing her would-be white rapist, right? And who's sent to jail, and creating a national campaign helping to support her children as she was in jail and advocating for her release, right? But the goal here is no matter what they were doing, at the core of their existence was an effort to secure the rights and liberties of Black women. But you
and
should
Ingram got out, didn't she? She got
yeah.
she ended up
She ended up being
getting away with it. Yeah.
Yes. But again, they drew national attention to it in the same way that you might see people drawing national attention to somebody that's, wrongly incarcerated or a political prisoner today. They had even though it was largely based in Harlem, they had groups along the Eastern Seaboard, and they had a national presence in terms of like newspapers and kind of gathering support. But it really was a nationalist and communist and feminist organization made of Black women by Black women in the height of the Red Scare. So it really was quite a phenomenal organization. And again, another example of a place where Queen Mother Moore felt like she could enact her nationalist principles, even if not everybody in the group was on the same page, right?
So I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I do want to come back because and I'll ask it by asking you to recount a little bit about how you talk about the variety of reasons and questions around why she left the Communist Party. But I did, if we could just go back to that a little bit and say a little bit more about this Garveyite, communist, nationalist, like how is this all happening? I mean,
that's a great question.
And then why did she leave?
So, Garvey is immensely popular, obviously, in the United States and globally. So, the feds were not having that. And so what is the number one way they get Black people that get too big in the early to mid 20th century, the 19th century? You can convict them of mail fraud. So Garvey was convicted of mail fraud for soliciting stock in his shipping company, the Black Star Line, and he's deported in 1928. So even though the UNIA is still, a big deal in the United States, it does dissipate without Garvey there. Now, the Communist Party has also been existing in the United States and sees a whole group of workers, Black working class folks, who have historically not wanted anything to do with them, right? There is a moment where they see an opportunity, and by they, I mean the international leadership of the Comintern. And like I said, they create something called the Black Belt Thesis, a 1920 a proclamation that says that, Black people are a nation basically within a nation, and have the right to self-determination and to secede from the United States if they so desire, right? But really, what gets most Black people on board with the Communist Party is their defense of the Scottsboro Boys. In 1931, 9 African-American youths, talking young boys mostly, right, are accused of raping 2 white women on a train that they get pulled off in Scottsboro, Alabama. They're convicted in one day. And it was a case that for a long time, groups like the NAACP wouldn't touch, right? Because they didn't want to be involved in kind of the sexual politics of it. But the Communist Party got on board, and their legal wing started defending the boys. And it was the Scottsboro Boys was, it was the George Floyd moment of the 1930s, right? And so their willingness to do that, their willingness to work for everyday working class Black people with rent strikes and, kind of everyday struggles got people on board. So Queen Mother Moore says that she saw the Communist Party one day when she was in Harlem. She migrated to Harlem, and she said, well, they are talking about this thing Garvey's talking about, and they're doing these strikes. It seemed like a good thing to help my people. And she calls it a vehicle. That's her words for helping, right? So it isn't as though she doesn't want to be a Black nationalist anymore, but it seems a good place to enact her Black nationalist principles. And for many people, it was.
Yeah, right on. And then the reason she ends up leaving, you touch on a little bit. There has to be a little bit of speculation involved, but what?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation. The Communist Party veers away from the Black Belt thesis after World War II, and she feels as though it is an abandonment of Black people who spent the better part of 2 decades working for them and advocating on their behalf. I mean, many Black women and Black people rose in the ranks of the Communist Party, herself included. It was a really good place for Black women to organize, and so she felt that they turned their backs on Black people and the Black working class. That being said, she also says that many of her comrades were always suspicious of her because they felt like she didn't entirely buy in. But she describes it as a heartbreak. She describes being physically sick when she realized that all of this effort that she had given to these people, all this effort that she had given towards this kind of global proletariat revolution, really was for naught and being abandoned by the white leadership the moment it was not politically expedient anymore. And she describes it as a real turning point in her life, and a central moment where any trust she thought she might have had in interracial organizing was gone. Now, that being said, she still always credited the Communist Party with offering her a class analysis that she says that she didn't exactly have, right? She said they taught her the day-to-day organizing in a way. She said Garveyism wasn't organizing day-to-day the way the Communist Party was. That to be a Garveyite, it wasn't the same. And it really, she had to read, she had to study, and she really learned, the science of capitalism and the science of capitalist revolution. And as Black Power organizers like Muhammad Ahmed or other folks organized, they constantly sought her counsel in explaining to them, kind of how to do a revolutionary nationalist approach to organizing because of that.
So I know we only have a few more minutes, but I have to say that Anthony in our chat has raised a couple of questions that have come up over the years. So is your forthcoming book, are you going to get into any of the rumors or the because being around so long, she definitely had a couple beefs, she had a couple rumors and little and I had done my master's thesis at one point on Dr. Clark, John Henrik Clark, and so I mean, I was heard a lot of thises and that's and including this issue about her real or not relationships with white men. Is any of this has any of this in your book, or is this or in your research at all? Are you or do you avoid all of this stuff as much as possible?
It's complicated, right? Because she very much tried to separate the personal and the private, or dissemble, as we call it. And we have to think about what we owe Black women like her in doing that. I certainly talk about her relationship. She was married at least 3 times that we know over the course of her life. And I have a very good relationship with her son and her granddaughters. And I talk about the complicated politics of what it was like to have a family or lack there, or not be there for your family, right? Because you were organizing. I talked briefly about the beefs between her and some of the men who she feels she stole her ideas, right? Or got credit for her ideas. But I don't go too far into speculation, because I do think that ethically we owe Black women the respect, particularly women like Queen Mother Moore, of not speculating what we don't know about and letting some things stay private that it's clear that she wanted to stay private. This is really a political biography, right? And in some ways an organizing manual. Kind of less titillating account of a Black woman's lives. Right?
Yeah, no, I like I said, I couldn't help. I saw Anthony raise the questions, and I was like, they were in my mind too. They were in my mind too. So listen, in the last thing, I'll just invite you to as a closing question. I did want to ask if, to the extent that, what gaps in Moore's research is your work filling? Is there anything in particular, or just a sort of everything?
It is a cradle to grave biography, so it's a significant piece of work. I mean, I think most people that know have met Queen Mother Moore, right? Everywhere I go, there's, I meet somebody who has an experience with her, met her, in the last part of her life, right? So really one of the things that you are getting when you read the biography is the history of how she became the person that, many of us encountered in her later life, and really how she became the Queen Mother in a way of the movement. So I spent a year going back and forth to New Iberia, Louisiana, and, digging through records to find her family. I've got images of her parents, for example, right, in the book. I think that a lot of people will be surprised with the coalitions that she engaged in and some of the strange bedfellows that organizing makes, right? Again, a lesson in tactical working together in order to achieve a goal, right? Even as you stay true to your principles. And I think people will be surprised by the level of international notoriety that she had. If you're not as familiar or steeped in kind of Pan-African and African history, I count her multiple trips to different African countries in the 1970s, and the treatment of her really speaks volumes to how much of a global reputation she had. So I think, and then again, like I said, there are, some private moments. I don't think most of the people know about the 3 husbands and everything going on there. So there's something for everybody. Everybody will learn something new about Queen Mother Moore.
And when is the book gonna when
right now we're slated
do we
for
have
the
a win
second half
yet?
of next year. So hopefully we stay on schedule. Publication stuff is tough, but second half of next year we're looking at. Yeah.
Well, congratulations in advance. Congratulations on all the work you've obviously already produced, and the link and about which people can learn more, and the link in the show description. And Dr. Farmer, thank you very much. I look forward to when you come back to talk maybe about the next book.
Yeah, we love that. Thank you all for having me and engaging. I appreciate it.
Right on. Take care. Good luck with everything.
Bye-bye.
All right. Peace. All right, everybody. Big shout out to Professor Farmer. I hope you enjoyed that. I did. That was a great discussion. The work she's produced already on Queen Mother Moore is fascinating. And I admit, for someone who hasn't made it Audley Moore a particular focus of my study, it was refreshing and a good read. Well-written stuff too. So right on. All right, everybody, please do like, share, subscribe, do all of those things that help, make this thing go algorithmically. And you can always double back and go to blackpowermedia.org and find a way to support. Immaterially is just as good. Like, share, subscribe, tell somebody to come on through. Comment, that helps.
Put it in the comments.
And we'll keep it moving. Make sure you have the bell rung, and so you don't miss all the stuff coming from the variety of programming we have. And no, thank you. I appreciate you coming through. Yeah, I don't know. She I don't know. But oh, word. All right, I'm out of here. Peace, everybody. My bad. Did I mess up today? That might be my fault again. My apologies, everybody. Peace if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and all throughout the network at BPM. Peace, only if you're willing to fight for it.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.